helps define the region better. Australia was arguably one of the first nations to discuss the idea of Indo Pacific through its defense white papers. The Trump administration, since its early days, preferred the use of the term Indo Pacific in its official documents in lieu of Asia Pacific for reasons not hard to discern. It formalized the arrangement on 30th May 2018 by renaming the US Pacific Command as Indo Pacific Command. Now, at the change of command ceremony for the newly instituted command, US Defense Secretary clarified that the renaming had been done in recognition of the increasing connectivity of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Now, unlike the conceptual term Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific, whose boundaries are subject to a fair amount of variations depending on each state's individual preferences, the Indo Pacific Command is more definitive in its construct. Now, it has to be being a combatant, US combatant command. It stretches from the west coast of the United States to India towards the west, and from the Arctic in the north due south to the Antarctic, incorporating 52% of the Earth's total surface. Now, the Indo Pacific region, by contrast, has been conjured by the joining together of two of the world's largest oceans, their main connectivity being through the Malacca Strait, perhaps the busiest of the world's trading waterways. Nurtured by the phenomenon called globalization, as well as the interconnectedness it has spawned, the Indo Pacific has emerged as virtually the center of the globe in terms of politics, trade, and economics. The fact that it contains the world's most populous nations, the world's most dynamic economies, the world's most voracious gas guzzlers, as well as a huge stretch of the global maritime commons, has helped fuel its importance. There can be no doubt that all peripheral countries have a stake in the Indo Pacific region's collective stability, as their own individual prosperity is also associated with the free flow of trade through it. The Indo Pacific strategy of the United States, a natural successor to the Asian Pacific rebalance, calls for a free and open Indo Pacific. Now, China, which is comparatively far more dependent on the region's vital waterways for its trade needs, is a strong advocate for harmony in the two oceans. The Indian Prime Minister has renamed his country's strategic vision Sagar, security and growth for all in the region. Japan, Japan's Prime Minister Abe's vision regarding the confluence of the two seas, as he puts it, much like incorporates the promotion of infrastructure, much like China, from the east of Asia all the way to Africa. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with such a perfect alignment of views between the principal actors, what possible challenges can the region present? To understand the undercurrents in play, one has to scratch the surface. And delving into the past may perhaps help to best explain the region's current dynamics. The Indian Ocean had, since millennia, acted as a magnet for widespread trade, till the Arab lead in trading and marining was undermined in 1498 by the entry into Calicut of the Portuguese adventurer Vasco da Gama after rounding the Cape of Good Hope. This sparked off the era of colonialism, 4 centuries of which wreaked havoc on the region's economics and politics. With the Portuguese having seized control of the Indian Ocean's strategic choke points, Jorge Alvarez sailed due north from Malacca to reach Guangzhou in China. Now, like the Indian Ocean littorals, countries and islands in the Pacific too were colonized. By the time the First World War broke out, however, Japan controlled most of the Western Pacific, while the US held Guam and Philippines, which it had wrested from Spain in 1898. Now, just as the Indian Ocean was considered a British lake at the commencement of the Second World War, the Pacific came to be similarly dominated by the United States after the war. But as the British star was waning, India started considering itself as the obvious inheritor of its mantle. Britain, though, had other ideas. With an eye on the Soviet threat, it surreptitiously expropriated a large portion of the western Indian Ocean, of which the Chagos Peninsula, including the atoll of Diego Garcia, was a part. It then leased it to the United States the following year, with Diego Garcia being turned into the largest military base in the region. Now, the US also has a string of bases in the Pacific, from Hawaii to Okinawa. The US remains the predominant naval power in both the Pacific and Indian Oceans throughout the Cold War and became even more formidable after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The, the Indo US uh, naval relationship started blossoming from the first multilateral Malabar naval exercise held in 1993. The two countries went on to sign the General Security Agreement, GSOMIA, in 2002 to ensure that the information shared by the Pentagon with India is adequately safeguarded. After a lull of nearly 14 years, the two countries signed the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, LEMOA, this being the first foundation agreement. Now, it was meant to facilitate the provision of logistical support between the respective militaries on a reimbursable basis to make joint operations more efficient. This was followed up in 2018 with COMCASA, or Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, to enable the US to supply critical and encrypted defense technologies without fear of compromise. This agreement allows India access to US intelligence data, including real-time imagery, enabling interoperability on highly secure systems. The fourth agreement, BICA, or Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement for Geospatial Collaboration, was hurriedly signed just a week before the US presidential election 2020. This allows the two countries to share advanced satellite and topographic data for long range navigation and missile targeting. Now, from Pakistan's perspective, this is obviously bad news. Having a large unfriendly neighbor was bad enough. Now, having that neighbor team up with the biggest military in the world to obtain highly sensitive targeting data through highly secure data links is a disaster. So, on its part, the US has sought to dampen the Indian fixation on Pakistan and reset its focus towards their principal mutual adversary, China. Now, through these agreements, plus granting India the status of a major defense partner, the US is attempting to kill three birds with one stone. First, wean India away from its near total reliance on Russia for its military hardware, replace Russia as India's principal arms supplier, and thirdly, bolster India's credentials as a counterweight to China, both in the Indian Ocean as well as in the Western Pacific through the so-called Quad arrangement. Now, using the interoperability card, the US has transferred high-end defense equipment to India, smothering the latter in its embrace. Although this bilateral cooperation is meant to advance US interests in the region, Pakistan can't be blamed for feeling the heat. The US has, however, tried to keep India and Pakistan apart by placing the two countries under two different combatant commands, Indo-Pacific in one case and CENTCOM in the other. US patronage has also enabled India to conclude a military agreement with France in March 2018, granting mutual access to naval bases. A similar agreement with Australia in June 2020 also permits the use of each other's military bases. So while India's inclusion in the US-sponsored quadrilateral dialogue and more recently the Quad Plus anti-China grouping may have helped the latter agreement to come about, India cannot remain unmindful of the pitfalls such a stance carries. China is not only one of India's biggest trading partners, the two countries also share a huge contested land border. Despite its visible discomfort at the nature of this relationship, India is not only trying to derive its own security benefits out of it, but also to live up to the United States' expectations of being a net security provider by modernizing its forces and expanding its reach. Just weeks prior to securing access to France's regional outposts, India also signed a military agreement with Oman that will allow its military vessels to dock at the newly built port of Duqm. Now, further south of the East African coast, India is trying to enhance its surveillance and defense capabilities by developing Assumption Island in the Seychelles and Agalega Island in Mauritius. Taken together, the naval arrangements in Middle Eastern and East African countries help advance India's claims of being a key regional power. India thus appears to be on a roller coaster ride with wide access to the latest hardware, the most modern technology, the most secure data links, the most precise targeting information, along with a large number of regional military bases. As they say, there are no free lunches. So India has to perforce toward the US line. But as India switches over to Western operating systems, age-old friendship with Russia is increasingly coming under strain. Russia used to be India's main military supplier, with Russian origin munitions and equipment still constituting 67% of India's military inventory. Replacing its Russian inventory with the vastly more expensive Western hardware will place India's economy under great strain. The bulk of India's air force consists of aging Russian fighters, and replacing so many of them with Western jets is not a sustainable proposition, considering that the controversial 2016 deal with France for the supply of 36 Rafale fighter jets has cost it $9.4 billion. So while estranging Russia, whose presence looms large in the neighborhood, does not seem to be a good idea for short-term gains, India would be saddled with a bigger dilemma if, as is likely, US-Russian relations further deteriorate. Russia is not entirely oblivious of these machinations. In December 2020, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, while speaking at a meeting of the Russian International Affairs Council, described India as an object of Western countries' persistent, aggressive, and devious policy, trying to engage it in anti-China games by promoting Indo-Pacific strategies, the so-called Quad, while at the same time attempting to undermine Russia's close partnership and privileged relations with India. So it is a matter of time before Russian focus shifts from the manipulating West to the willingly manipulated India. Ladies and gentlemen, it is, however, in the South China Sea where India will be severely tested. It has already learned the hard way via the Ladakh skirmish of June 2020 and the recent Sikkim face-off that a stridently hostile stance towards China would not come cheap. Taking a leaf from the US policies of Asia-Pacific rebalance and pivot to Asia, India devised its own look east followed by act east strategies. Now, from a practical angle, these Indian strategies are, however, out of sync with its actions on the ground. China's Belt and Road Initiative, including the Maritime Silk Road, has emerged as another major flashpoint. BRI is breathtakingly ambitious in its scope, seeking to bring together under its umbrella the length and breadth of the Asian, African, and European continents, not to mention Latin America, which it intends to link via the sea route. Ever since a freight train made its way from Yiwu, a manufacturing hub in eastern China, to London in early 2017, the amount of freight being carried out through rail across Eurasia has quadrupled. That an initiative which seeks to promote connectivities for balanced and sustainable regional development is being viewed with suspicion by some countries is indeed surprising. Pakistan, as the most prominent face of the BRI, in the Indian Ocean is bound to attract greater uninvited attention, which can manifest itself in various devious ways. Now, as far as flashpoints go, its epicenter has, since the past decade or so, shifted to the South China Sea. From an economic and political viewpoint, this is as important a stretch of water as any in the world. Around one third of global shipping, including 40% of the world's LNG trade, passes through the South China Sea. Its trade value being estimated at $3.4 trillion. Now, these waters are comparatively more vital for China, as not only 64% of its maritime trade passes through it, so does 80% of its oil imports, on which it is overtly reliant. Since such a vast quantity of China's oil imports have to traverse the narrow Malacca Strait, it gives rise to a vulnerability referred to by President Hu Jintao in 2003 as China's Malacca dilemma. China's bid to develop Kyaukphyu port in Myanmar, Gwadar in Pakistan, and its proposal to create the Kra Isthmus through Thailand can all be seen as endeavors to lessen the channel's criticality. The South China Sea, ladies and gentlemen, contains over 250 small islands, atolls, shoals, reefs, and sandbars, most of which have no indigenous people, many of which are naturally underwater at high tide, and some of which are permanently submerged. It is beset with competing maritime claims. Now, what makes the issue difficult to resolve is that China claims almost 90% of the total sea area as its own and refuses to budge from its unilateral stance. Now, its background goes back to 1948, when as Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists were being relentlessly pursued by Mao's revolutionaries, they laid claim to almost the entire South China Sea, as demarcated what has since been known as the Nine Dash Line. Soon thereafter, when Mao's forces had wrested control of mainland China and Chiang's supporters retreated to the island enclave of Taiwan, both sides made this claim their own. It was, however, formally revived in 2008 when China used it to rebut a joint Malaysian Vietnamese application for extension of their country's continental shelves under UNCLOS. Now, this dispute was given an extra regional flavor in 2010 when US Secretary of State urged for a peaceful diplomatic solution as per UNCLOS, which predictably didn't sit well with Beijing. Now, since then, China has created numerous facts on the ground in the shape of artificial islands, 27 by last count, which, apart from being self sustaining, are now capable of serving as a fleet of unsinkable aircraft carriers. Coercive tactics against competing claimants have also been on the rise. The US Navy, in turn, conducts so called freedom of navigation patrols, FONOPs, to demonstrate the international status of these waters. China's strong response to such perceived incursions has further heightened tensions. In order to prevent matters from spiraling out of control, the two navies have jointly evolved some rules of engagement for responding to close encounters at sea. So from the perspective of international law, there doesn't seem to be a legal basis for China's claim to such a large sea area. The International Arbitral Tribunal, approached by the Philippines, reached the same conclusion. It found no legal basis for China to assert historic rights on the sea areas falling within the Nine Dash Line and said that what China was referring to as exclusive historical control was simply the exercising of existing high seas freedom under international law. The tribunal was also critical of China's land reclamation projects in the Spratleys. The question thus arises as to why would China deliberately antagonize its neighboring countries with which it enjoys strong investment and trading ties by insisting on such a legally untenable claim? So the answer is simple. China sees the surrounding sea area as vital to its national security and economic well-being, providing not only a natural shield against outside disruptions to its coastal economic activities, but also a badly needed sanctuary for its ballistic missile nuclear submarines. The ubiquitous presence of the US military so far from its own shores has raised the threat level to a degree which China cannot afford to ignore. It revives memories of the country's century of humiliation, which led to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. It is haunted by its past, in which an imperialist Britain forced it to accede to its own interpretation of free trade by waging the Opium Wars of 1842 and 1856, with other countries like the US, Russia, and France aggressively pursuing the same concessions. So, apart from the Quad and Quad Plus arrangements, the Trump administration had further vitiated the environment by waging a trade war with China, inclusive of sanctions, tariffs, investment restrictions, technology protections, and even imposition of visa limits. As a country which has, since the Second World War, been treating the Pacific Ocean as its backyard, the United States understandably wary of a rising China and a resurgent Russia. The world has to beware of falling into the Thucydides trap. Professor Rory Metcalf of the Australian National University has aptly described the existing scenario as a kind of a full spectrum staring contest. It is also a catastrophe in waiting, one that can only be prevented if good sense and sound judgment prevails all round. The interconnected nature of the two oceans means that no state can remain unaffected by turmoil anywhere in the region. All states, Pakistan included, should thus play their part in lowering the temperature rather than becoming a part of the problem. Now, to recap, the sort of challenges Pakistan faces in a rapidly evolving environment are multi pronged. First is the threat posed by its larger neighbor, India, which, by spreading its tentacles all around the Indian Ocean, is seeking to dominate it. Second is its growing relationship with the United States, which has enabled it to gain access to the latest technology in military hardware and even to precise targeting information. Third is the standoff between the US and China, which President Xi Jinping has recently dubbed as a new Cold War. Pakistan's friendly ties with China in military, economic, and diplomatic spheres is bound to come in the US crosshairs sooner rather than later. The animosity towards CPEC that both the US and India share is again something that Pakistan has to contend with. Indian machinations are something that Pakistan is used to dealing with. With American support behind India acting as a force multiplier, Pakistan has to step up its game. But what Pakistan has to really worry about is an embittered United States, which, after having dealt with the tricky uh, Afghan issue and increasingly stalemated by China in the South China Sea, turns on Pakistan and CPEC as a convenient scapegoat. So, ladies and gentlemen, the fifth generation hybrid warfare of today takes many forms, to counter which Pakistan needs to keep its guard up. Pakistan appears to be walking on a tightrope. It would need the most skillful of diplomacy to sustain this balancing act. I thank you all.
Thank you, Admiral Pervez Asgar. I will now open the floor to questions. If there are any questions from the floor, we will first take those questions. And then, if there are any from the webinar, people who have joined the webinar, we'll take those. जी ये माइक है भाई साहब इनको दो.
Assalamualaikum, sir. My name is Aga Masood. I'm the editor of Financial Daily. You have not discussed about the role of Chinese Navy in Indian Ocean. In the past, Indian Ocean was called the Lake of India. So, how do you describe the role of Chinese Navy in Indian Ocean?
Okay, firstly, it was never called the Lake of India. Uh, okay, but I've read a lot about this, and I know it isn't so. Um, since 1498, in fact, most of the traders used to be Arabs, generally from Bahrain and Yemen and other countries, and uh, the manufacturing hubs were inside, but the traders, the middlemen were mostly from Gujarat. That's why Gujarat is still a flourishing community as far as trade is concerned. The problem, as I mentioned here, that India, after the British were leaving, this is something that India aspired to have the same sort of mantle which Britain had. But Britain, what it did exactly was to create a zone, a territory in the Chagos Peninsula, and then leased it to the United States under very controversial circumstances. So that has become the largest base in the area, and the Indian Ocean has since been dominated by the United States. What the stance which India used to take was that the foreign powers should all vacate the area, because at that time it was more aligned with the Soviet Union. But it didn't say the same about the Soviets, who had a very limited presence, merely because they didn't have too many bases. It's only for a short spell they had some bases in Ethiopia, for instance. But later on, when it was fighting with Somalia, they was forced to vacate from there also. What generally people talk about, and I think it's obvious also, that uh, it has mostly been bothered about land areas. We have had 3, 4 conflicts with India. China has a conflict in 1962. That is why it somehow couldn't develop the sort of navy as per international standards. And this is its problem even now. So if it expects to go that way, it has to spend an extraordinary amount of money. But like I said, the regions are so interconnected that if it goes against China in the South China Sea, as per the Quad arrangement, which the US wants, it is very vulnerable on land. And even in the South China Sea, China is very strong in the South China Sea. Understandably so, because that's its backyard, and also it's vital to its own security interests. China used to be kept away because of propaganda, US propaganda, India propaganda. Every time they used to do something, the propagandists start working. And when China started developing ports, they used to call it the string of pearls strategy, that means seeking to dominate. China didn't have much of a presence in the Indian Ocean for a long time, and for understandably so, because it wanted to focus more on the economic aspects rather than fighting a non-existent war. But it was the Somalian piracy of 2009, in which a lot of other countries were represented also, which enabled the Chinese Navy to be also present over there physically. But since then, it is slightly making its way in, and it's built the Kyaukphyu port in Burma, in Myanmar, um, in Sri Lanka. It's built a port also. Gwadar is there also. In Kenya also, I believe they are even sponsoring a terminal in Haifa also. So it's the maritime component is going strong as per the maritime Silk Route also. And for the first time, I think they're actually building a base at Djibouti. And you'll be surprised that the Americans and the French also have a bases in Djibouti. It's a small country, but China is building one too. So this is the first time that its presence is actually being being felt. But like I said, it's so the nature is such that it's so interconnected that you can't say that one is dominant here and the other won't react in some other place. And that is why in a lot of places it's opening up the Eurasian front also as far as rail travel is concerned, um, incorporating a lot of people in its trading ties. That's why you find a lot of people don't complain that much as far as this South China Sea strategy is concerned, because of its strong trading ties and its investing path. That is where China is strongest.
Is there another question from the floor? Maz, Maz Saab ko do. Come back.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. My name's Maz. I'm actually a director at the Ziauddin University. I have two questions. One for Salman Bashir. You stated in the quotations from Xi Jinping's book that China's focus is development, and such a goal can only be pursued through peace. And you quoted the former vice foreign minister in the similar regards that aggressive nations, through such policies, bring about their own demise. How would you term the situation in Sikkim between China and India? Just a show for some political gain, alternative political game, or perhaps a counter pressure to relieve Pakistan? Your thoughts on that? And for Azhar Saab, you mentioned Myanmar, and I wanted to bring back that as to the recent events that have occurred there. Is there any connection to this maritime geostrategic struggle for the events that have occurred in the recent coup? And also, I'd like just your thoughts on the potential of Indonesia being a potential country that could be targeted for a breakup to put pressure on China because of its ethnicity. There's a lot of talk about, if there's nations that may collapse, Indonesia is at the top of the list as a result of that. Thank you.
Salman Sir, would you like to come in now? Salman Saab, there's a question for you. Can you
Sorry.
unmute?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. I just unmuted. Uh, Interesting questions. I think so far we were not able to sort of touch on the China-India contestation. Uh, Indirectly, of course, we've talked about it, but the fact is that, as I said earlier, China continued to exhibit immense strategic patience vis-a-vis India. There's a long history to the line of actual control. They, at the highest levels, were talking about it. They were able to formulate principles and frameworks diplomatically between China and India. But what prompted the developments in Ladakh region uh, last year and the continuing tensions and standoff along the China-India border, whether the west or towards the east? The fact is, and I think this is probably something that your institute may wish to note and sort of reflect and research upon. I think, in my estimation, the tipping point came on 5 August 2019 with the dissolution, attempted purported dissolution of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And the renewed claims by the Indian government to Aksai Chin. So what we saw, what we have seen last year, and what we continue to see along the China-India border is that now the Chinese have run out of patience as far as India is concerned. This was a strong message to India, the developments last year, that beware and do not, get into this proxy business vis-a-vis the anti-China coalition. More importantly for Pakistan, I think this is a fact that which probably we did not sort of avail of adequately, in my view. China, for the first time, asserted itself not only in terms of what it's been doing in the Security Council on the issue of Kashmir, but also on the ground. The least we could have done at that time was to say that India should vacate Siachen. These contestations on the ground were very close to Siachen, where Pakistan has a definite interest. So I think these are the sort of things about Sikkim and Arunachal Pradesh and other things. There again, Chinese are well placed, and if they wanted, they could sort of really bring maximum pressure to bear on India. But China-India relational aspects will have a direct impact on Pakistan, one. And now, if you look at the Indian media, They are all the time speaking of a two-front war. I think that is clear pointers to where the situation may go if the rigors of a new Cold War were to be imposed in the manner that Admiral Saab has suggested, indicated, in terms of technology transfers, etc. So, and China, whether it is South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or on the Eurasian mainland, is now quite capable of clearing these areas of trouble. And we will see this increasingly happening also towards the West, our West, the China-Iran relationship, the question marks relating to Afghanistan. But one point, besides this question, I wanted to point out, especially to Admiral Sahib and to the audience. You see, for centuries, it was the maritime powers that dominated the world. The colonial conquests and whatnot. What has happened is, in terms of China and Russia, the emergence and the convergence of their mutual interest in terms of uh, the emergence of land power. And of course, so actually, what makes the Indian Ocean relevant, besides the freedom of navigation operations, which is just an excuse, basically, it is a contest between land powers versus maritime powers. And I think that aspect needs to also be kept in view in terms of the strategic picture as evolving strategic picture. So we are seeing desperate efforts to resurrect the Quad in the Asia Pacific region, and most of these countries in East Asia, they will take a backseat. They have direct economic interests. They are too close to China. They will not participate or take a partisan view in these contestations. Thank you.
Admiral Saab.
Okay, what has happened in Myanmar is essentially a domestic issue. For I think for decades, ever since it became a state in itself, it has been dominated by the military, and it very unwillingly ceded power to the civilians. But even then, five years ago, when they had the first election, they had placed a lot of conditionalities. Defense minister would be there. Uh, the interior minister would be there. 25% of the seats would be with the military, and a lot of other places that they would exert a wide amount of support. I think what went wrong here is, and although uh, um, Madam Aung San Suu Kyi had made a lot of concessions and she wasn't troubling them enough, but the military still felt under General Lang that it probably the relationship had got a bit tenuous. And one of the reasons probably was personal. I think General Lang is, uh, 4 years ago, he had an extension, given himself an extension. He said he'll retire by the summer of this year. And possibly, I think what people are conjecturing is that he was worried about his family and his cronies' ties to big businesses, like happens elsewhere, like General Suharto in Indonesia. And they felt that if without an understanding being reached, all that would come under the scanner. And there are also reports that for 1 year, although Aung San Suu Kyi is supposed to be subservient to the military in a lot of ways, but for 1 year she hadn't even spoken to the military chief. So there was a cold relationship between them. So this is purely a domestic issue. But what it has done is it has placed the US in a fix. Under the previous administration, nobody would have raised an eyebrow because this is what the Trump administration wanted. Under the present administration, they're against the coups of all nature and they said so. And strong nationalist movements, and so on. Uh, President would be again in a bind because if it does impose sanctions and so on, uh, China is a northerly neighbor to Burma, and it's made huge amount of investments within Burma. In fact, it's given it its in Myanmar, giving its 5G technology also. So that's coming up. A pipeline has been laid, fuel pipeline from Krakpur port, which it has developed to the central regions of China. So those things won't lessen. What China is more interested in is stability, whether it's the military or anyone else, doesn't matter. Stability is what matters. As far as Indonesia is concerned, what you're talking about is a repeat of the incident that happened when General Suharto was in power. Um, Times have changed. I think they've gone. They have a more democratic Outlook now. And besides, Indonesia itself is not entirely in China's camp. It also has a dispute as far as the South China Sea is concerned, uh, because what it calls the Sea of Natuna is north of the Natuna island. The China encompasses it in its nine-dash line. So there's a small bit of dispute there also. At the same time, it is part of the ASEAN bloc, which is part of Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And all the ASEAN countries are part of that. And in Quad Plus also, the ultimate aim is to bring all the ASEAN countries, which includes Indonesia, to form a joint front against China. But I think Malaysia has been the most mature of the lot because it has, just like in the formation of ASEAN itself, they put disputes to one side and said, let's focus on the economics. And this is what I think they've done in this particular case also, not focusing so much on the disputes, but they brought a lot of maturity to this. And ASEAN, as a result, has prospered because of this maturity. So I don't think that considering the present stability with Indonesia enjoys, it's a very rapidly evolving country. I don't think the chances of a repeat of the 65 incident would probably happen.
Ji, there are many questions in the queue, so I'll come back to you because there are many questions. There's a question over here. आप पूछना चाह रहे थे? Come back to you.
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. I have a two-point question in the context of unfolding is geostrategic landscape. You talked about Quad, Malacca dilemma, Hujintao, nine dot line, and so forth. What about a string of pearl in the context of Humban Toto as a harbinger, which is quite a controversy as far as future of the region is concerned? And secondly, you didn't talk about the deal that they have entered into as far as Iranian factor is concerned. So would you like to expand on both of them? Thank you.
Okay, because of time limitations, I didn't talk about the string of pearls because it's an outdated concept now. It was initially made by United States in the context that it wanted to keep China out. So whatever it did, it evinced a lot of propaganda from this side. But so far, I think they don't talk that much about it. But what China has done, although people call it a string of pearls strategy, but it's actually for its maritime silk routes, and they are developing all these as sports is part of a wider uh, corridor. So, and like I said previously, they did keep the Chinese out, but when China became a little more resurgent, and that is, I think, around 2012, 2013. That 2013, I believe, is the year when it surpassed the US as the biggest trading nation in the world, and that is why it then started asserting itself as its own claim is concerned. In, hmm? Hambantota, huh? In the case of Hambantota, what had happened was that they had developed the port as per the request of the Sri Lankan government because Colombo port was getting saturated. It's midstream and it's a highly profitable port, lot of traffic going that way, so they wanted an alternate port. And I think the the president at the time also had a personal stake in it because he was very close to the state of to the port of Hambantota, and they built a cricket stadium and whatnot. So understandably, when there was a change of government, uh, obviously they tried to scale it down. But so then China asked them to repay the loan, and when they couldn't, so they gave it a 99-year lease. But so far, I think it's not. Maybe in the long term it will, because Colombo is a well-established port, and the Chinese have also, I think, invested in containers in the container terminal in the Colombo port. So that is a very busy port. And there were also talk, in fact, just a few months before the last government was dissolved, they had even given permission for Japanese India to form a joint terminal. And the new government, I think, is pro for China, so they had scrapped that. Chaba asked some question. Iranian connection with the China is that so far I think it's by and large is abiding by the U.S. Sanctions. But what it is doing is it has been taking oil from Iran at subsidized prices. So they've worked out a technicality that when the oil comes, they actually store it, so it's not traded as such, and that is why it doesn't fit into the sanctions regime. About 6 months back, I think there was talk, and there was an article, I think, in the New York Times also about a $400 billion investment deal which the Chinese have worked out with Iran. Uh, Similar 400, 450 theoretical figures, but that again hasn't materialized. Although the article said that all details are ready and has been to be approved by the Iranian parliament, but so far it hasn't materialized. Although it's supposed to be a win-win situation, but the question is, would China blatantly violate the U.S. sanctions? Possibly with the new administration in place, it can afford to do so, and it's a win-win situation because they're getting oil at highly subsidized prices, and in return, they're developing the infrastructure, also the rail infrastructure in particular, because it's rail network that takes them on to Europe. They already have three routes going to Europe, and the northern routes are all saturated. So the one via Iran and Turkey and so on, mm, Lake Van, take it on to Europe would be more profitable in future. And they've already, I think, investing in Central Asia also. So most of the corridor is complete, and high-speed trains, similar gauges, would take them all the way to Europe. So that's where the incidents coincide.
We are running out of time, and there are many other questions from the web. So if you don't mind, can I take them? The first question from the people who are participating in the webinar is for Ambassador Salman Bashir. Do you foresee a reset in Sino-US ties since the election of Biden, or should one expect the same tough stance taken by Trump? You can, in fact, we can club these, Ambassador Saab. There is another question. There is ample evidence of India's propaganda tactics, but how can we make the world listen to us? So, if you could give a concise answer, then I will go on to the next questions.
Well, thank you. I think both very pertinent questions. The first, my short answer is that if US were to go by reason and its own national interest, the Biden administration should certainly try to reset its ties with China. I think US loses more in this contestation. There's great interdependence, economic, etc., and US will gain by by softening its stand and identifying areas of cooperation, especially in Afghanistan, in our part of the world with China. How do we make the world listen to us on Kashmir and on India? I think we have done enough to convince the world to listen to our point of view. I think there is nothing more that we can do. Let's not indulge in self, criticism. Uh, if the world is going by its interests and not by the principles and morality that we expect of it, then it is the world's problem. Then, as Jaltazi said, let's for once focus on the positives that we have. I would just end by making a short comment. I think we have heard about all these contestations and the big power play and whatnot, but actually, I think Pakistan today is much better placed than other countries, and I'm sure in the second session you will hear more about it from other speakers. I think India is isolated within its own region, and its aspirations for global status stand diminished. And in fact, it set out to isolate Pakistan, and actually, it has isolated itself. So all this high-sounding talk about, these terminologies that we hear, whether it's all part of the propaganda against China, string of pearls, predatory economics, etc. That is all a lot of talk. I think what is happening on the ground is physical, is material, and it matters. And Pakistan is happily part of these geo-economic processes which will prevail over geopolitics. Thank you.
Agha Saab, I'll give you the last question, but there are two questions here for Admiral Parvez Asgar. I'll club them together. India's docking of military vessels at the port of Oman and other various naval arrangements seem to be encircling Pakistan and Chinese interests. So, how can a response be generated in an effective and timely manner? Or what kind of response can we expect to see? That is the first question. And the second question is, as you have mentioned, that India's 67% military equipment is of Russian origin. May I know how much time and money does India require to shift military hardware from Russian origin to Western or US origin? If you could concisely answer.
Sorry, the first question was India's. I personally don't think we should read too much into India's involvement in the port of Duqm for military purposes, for the simple reason that it's a newly built port, and India is already heavily invested in it. And so has China, for that matter, and I believe Saudi Arabia is also invested in that port. Um, so they have negotiated a settlement where they could dock the vessels there. To me personally, it doesn't have that much of a military significance because, in any case, if you especially not go there for docking purposes, then you have docks on your own. But if in case of emergency, so regardless of whether you have an agreement or not, and I know this from a personal basis, uh, if you request it via the foreign office and say this particular ship has an emergency and needs docking, I think all states comply with this request. So to me, I think we shouldn't read too much into it. It's just that it's going to uh, conduct a lot of these military bases agreements just to make sure that it's a big regional power like it has in the case of France, for instance, that gives it access to even the UAE bases, for instance. But otherwise, I think we shouldn't worry so much. As far as its dominance is concerned, it could even because if you look at its geography, It could even dominate without actually going uh, into this particular bases of ports and so on. Uh, these days, ships have, if you have a logistic vessel with you, you can go places, number of places, and so can your maritime patrol aircraft also, if you really want to dominate. So this is just, I think, a way of actually involving other countries and to make its dominant advantage more, and that's why it has entered into Seychelles and Mauritius, and investing a lot of money there. As far as your second question is concerned about the munitions, it's a tough fact, but the process has been ongoing. For instance, we have seen now that they had the Soviet kilo class submarines that's being replaced now with the Scorpion submarines from France. Then you had the maritime patrol aircraft used to be traditionally uh, Russian. There are two different types, and they've been now replaced by the Poseidons, A-type Poseidons, which is the latest version of P3Cs that we had. And similarly, they have from the US, they have the Guardian drones in addition to communication equipment. What the US has done actually is to bring it closer to its own circuit so that in future, when it wants to go in for aircraft or other cases, it has to turn to the US in terms of communication compatibility. But like we have seen in the special case of the fighter jets that I mentioned, it's very difficult for them to wean it away. They've recently had, like I said, for 9.4 billion dollars, and there's so many MiG 19s and 21s, 23s that need to be replaced. It's very difficult, at least, for this to come about. Besides, in the carrier, because the first carrier is Russian, the the old Admiral Goshkov, that carries a MiG 29 aircraft anyway. So it's a laborious process, but I think India at the same time doesn't want to totally part of ways with Russia. That is why you've seen that they had a deal with Russia for S-400 SAMs, which is the latest. And this did sit well with the Trump administration, and they immediately threatened to slap trade sanctions on it. And India reciprocated that they would also uh, snap sanctions, and that's how the matter ended. In terms of warships, they've started this program of Make in India, so they probably have more Western technology coming in. But at the moment, I think all the warships are strongly Russian origin, even the latest ones. And even the equipment, the missile that they've developed, supersonic missile that they've developed, jointly developed, is with Russia. So it's very difficult to compete part of way with Russia, but this is what the US wants them to do.
There are some overlapping questions, so I will exercise my prerogative not to raise them. But there is a question from Anita Nilsson, who is a former director in the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I'll direct it to Ambassador Salman Bashir. First, she congratulates us on this webinar, and then she says, could the further development in the energy field, notably the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, be a source of continued or renewed interaction in a multi-dimensional manner in the political and policy fora within technology development and for infrastructure building? I raise the question because I am strongly convinced that real progress must contain dialogue even in difficult times. Ambassador sir?
Ji, thank you. I entirely agree. I think dialogue, even in difficult times, and especially in difficult times, is all the more necessary. I think there are certain what one calls global commons or regional commons. Clean energy, peaceful uses of nuclear energy require greater cooperation, greater sharing of information, I think we ought to do it within our region and through the IAEA and globally. So I entirely agree. There are a lot of comments. Of course, we see the Biden administration now prioritizing climate change after 4 years of Trump. Uh, that's good. There are so many other things that require attention. I think we need to develop constructive uh, constructs, energy, peaceful uses, multidimensional cooperation. I entirely agree. Thank you.
There is another question for you, Ambassador Saab. Why can't China counter the rhetoric created by the West regarding the Uyghurs? The government of Pakistan may accept the Chinese explanations, but the people of Pakistan don't follow such rhetoric blindly and have their doubts.
Well, Dr. Masuma Hassan, there is something that is a bit tragic about our region. I talk here about not only Pakistan but South Asia. We have this inclination, instinctive, maybe inherited from the colonial past, to pick up concepts and start believing in them without realizing their intrinsic worth or the real purposes behind that. Now, if Xinjiang is an issue, uh, I don't think it's an issue because I've served in China, I've been to Xinjiang many times, and I've interacted there, and there are thousands of Pakistani students who are studying it in Urumqi, etc. But my point here is, what about Kashmir? There was this earlier question, or there was a question that why doesn't the world listen to us? We have been crying hoarse about the persecution and the oppression of the people of Kashmir. So, what about when the Prime Minister of Pakistan talks about the genocidal policies of the Indian state? Why doesn't everybody sort of listen? Because these norms, these values that we were taught and we actually believe in have sort of evaporated. So that is unfortunate. So I don't think, I think Xinjiang, the situation is one of those aspects of the propaganda against China, like the situation in Hong Kong. It was played up. So I think no country, no Muslim country, no IC, even Turkey has said not a word about it. And President Erdogan is not really a great friend or admirer of Turkey's erstwhile allies. So what I mean to say here is that let's not be taken in by empty claims and buy into what we have been hearing. CPAC is Chinese colonization project. I mean, how silly can it be? Thank you.
Agha Saab, would you like to ask your
Yes.
question?
Salman Saab, my question is very simple. The Joe administration, Joe Biden administration has said that they are going to review the peace agreement between Afghan Taliban and the United States. And similarly, the Afghan Taliban has said they are also going to review the peace process. So how do you comment on that?
Well, this aspect actually sort of was missed out in the presentations and discussion. Of course, the Biden administration is entitled to review or take cognizance of what has happened in terms of the Doha process. The key point to note here is that I have not seen anything that to the effect that they are walking away or walking back from the Doha peace agreement. I think that's the key thing. As far as there are quotations, quotes being carried in the press emanating from NATO or ascribed to NATO officials that the Americans will not withdraw their forces as provided in the peace agreement by 1 May this year. Now, on that, of course, the Taliban have reacted, and The point is that this question of uh, any changes in the withdrawal timelines should have been negotiated or talked about with the Taliban. Unilateral statements by NATO officials to this effect create misgivings about intent. And of course, they directly impact the intra Afghan negotiations process. So, what we have seen for some months is that tangible progress in the Afghan negotiations has remained stalled because of the American elections and the uncertainty of the picture that will emerge with the new administration. But now the new administration is there, and we hope that they will not back away from the premise of the basic premise that there is no military solution to the Afghanistan problem, and that the only way out is dialogue and a political settlement arranged by the Afghan parties. On these points, I think we should all support. As far as the question of American withdrawal is concerned, my view is, and I think that is generally shared in Islamabad, we have always talked of responsible withdrawal. So I think America has certain obligations in terms of long term or short term stability and peace in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I'd like to wind up now because we have to break for lunch. But before I do that, there is a comment and a question by Senator Javed Jabbar. His comment is that he compliments all the speakers, Lieutenant General Ghazi and the Ambassador Salman Bashir and Rear Admiral Parvez Asghar. And he says that all three speakers highlight the need for Pakistan to invigorate policies and attention to East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australasia through official, economic, and public diplomacy. Our Foreign Office requires significant enhancement of capacity and outreach. Ambassador Saab, would you like to answer that?
I thought I answered it, answered this question to Senator Saib in the chat. But of course, I thank him for his comment. I agree that there is an all-round need for enhancing our capacities. Of course, a person of the stature of Senator Javed Jabbar, uh, his contribution and help and suggestions to the Foreign Office would be, I'm sure, immensely appreciated. Thank you.
I'd like to wrap up this session. Thank you very much. I want to thank both the speakers, Ambassador Salman Bashir and Rear Admiral Parvez Asghar, for their contribution to this session regarding the challenges which Pakistan faces in this geostrategic contestation. And entirely agree that so far as China is concerned, we should look at it, at its history, its culture, its achievements, its suffering also, in historical terms. And Ambassador Salman Bashir has pointed out the shift between geopolitics towards geoeconomics. He has also identified the restraint, the strategic restraint with which China has conducted both its foreign policy as well as its development policy. That it is also perhaps the only, if not the outstanding moral voice in global politics today. And he has quoted from the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Um, Rear Admiral Parvez Asghar Saab, you have opened a completely new vision, at least so far as I am concerned. And you have pointed out the claims of China in great detail, with which I personally was not familiar, and all the not only its claims, but also the way in works. The bad news for us, the collaboration between the United States and India, and in the sense in which the United States has become India's largest defense supplier. And you have also very succinctly listed the challenges which Pakistan faces. You also have said that India will be severely tested in the South China Sea in its aim also to become a major regional power. But as you said, there are no free lunches. Sometimes I think there are free lunches. But you said there are no free lunches. You said there are no free lunches, and we must, the India will ultimately have to toe the US line. We will now break up to lunch for lunch and come back after 1 hour to reconvene in the second session, which will deal with opportunities for Pakistan. Thank you very much.